Study Section 2, Educational Code and Art, and Need for Educational Policy and Reform Diagnosis. Introduction. In the previous session, you learned about educational policies and law. In this study session, you will learn about Education Act, Decree, Edit and Code, Education Ordinance, Law, Policy, Act, Decree, Edit and Code are initiated through reforms in most cases. You will also understand the need for educational policy and reform in educational system, the need for critical analysis of different policies and reforms in educational system with particular reference to Nigeria. This will help you to know the strengths as well as weaknesses of earlier policies and reforms with a view to recommending better policies or improving the existing ones. Learning outcomes for study section 2. At the end of this study session, you should be able to explain educational code and educational art, explain educational reform, explain the need for educational policy, discuss reasons for reform in education. Education codes. These are a collection of practical guidance with respect to the requirements of some statutory law. Education code, on the other hand, is like an appendix to an existing legal document on education. It is meant to codify or express in codes or systematize the existing education statutes in a form that will make them more meaningful to the administrators. Definition of educational codes. They are a set of rules meant for interpreting or streamlining the norms or rules for the purpose of public education. Failure to observe a code not necessarily renders a person liable to legal proceedings, but being an interpretation of a statute, it is admissible in evidence and can be contested in court. Thus, education code has little or no status of a law. A good example was the 1970 Education Edict, which focused on government takeover of schools. It emanated from the Nigerian situation after the end of civil war. The law was regarded as decree at the central, but interpreted to assume edict status at the state level. The 1970 Education Edict transferred to the state government the ownership of all private and voluntary agency schools. The edict also defined the term for the government takeover of schools, the setting up of the state school board for the purposes of managing the primary and post-primary schools, the function of the Ministry of Education in the areas of planning, supervision and inspection, including evaluation and maintenance of standards and control, and the setting up of a tribunal for purposes of determining if and how much compensation to the former proprietors of schools will be necessary in future. Educational reform. Reform denotes a change or improvement, especially in the political or social sphere. It also implies the change or improve something by correcting faults or removing inconsistencies about abuses and imposing modern methods or values. Therefore, educational reforms are seen as changes or improvement in educational practices necessitated by changing economic, social, and political situations. Omolewa 2007 simply put that educational reforms emanate from the basic conviction that considerable progress can be made in nation by its people through careful engineering of the educational process. Reforms are meant to improve on the present educational practice. Omolewa's submission is not different from the position of Duncan, 1938, on educational transformation when he argued that educational transformations are always the result and the symptoms of social transformations in times of which they are to be explained. In order for people to feel at any particular moment in the time they need to change its educational system, it is necessary that new ideas and needs have emerged in which the former system is no longer adequate. Duncan, 1938, 167. It can be inferred from the foregoing that educational policy is a major step in initiating reforms in any educational system. Need for educational policy. Education is the basis for development in any country in the world. The needs of any country will influence the direction of our educational goals. Thus, activities of stakeholders have to be channeled towards these educational goals. Educational policy is very essential to educational and national development of any country. The need for educational policy includes A. Educational policy gives direction to activities of stakeholders in the educational system. It helps government, teachers, educational administrators, and guidance counselors, educational institutions to know their roles and how they could contribute meaningfully towards realizing the policy vision. For instance, a teacher derives basis for his action from the policy documents, that is, national policy on education. If there is no uniform policy on education, the stakeholders may find it difficult to act in a coordinated manner. B. It is a framework that facilitates achievement of educational objectives. The policy specifies major objectives of education as well as specific objectives for each level. This helps educational practitioners at different levels of education to be acquainted with objectives they are expected to achieve. Their activities are tailored towards the achievement of these objectives. C. It facilitates educational administration at all levels, that is, primary, secondary, and tertiary, as well as at the levels of tiers of government, local, state, and federal. The different tiers responsible for educational administration know their roles and what are expected of them through educational policy. For instance, supervision of education takes place at different levels, while local, state, and federal governments play important roles. Each of these tiers derives its basis for supervisory action through educational policy as contained in national policy on education. D. It is the basis for curriculum development. Curriculum is the totality of experience which learners are exposed to under the guidance of a school. The focus as well as objectives of education determines the curriculum content. Thus, curriculum is derivative of education policy. This emphasizes the importance of educational policy in any country. It implies that a good education policy is a prerequisite for good curriculum. The selection of both curricular and co-curricular activities is guided by the major and specific objectives in the policy. E. It facilitates curriculum implementation. Curriculum implementation is aided by education policy. Specific and general objectives of education assist in curriculum implementation. Therefore, if the policy is not properly conceived, the curriculum implementation may suffer setback. It means that teachers, head teachers, educational supervisors, policymakers, and other stakeholders have to be conversant with education policy so as to ensure effective achievement of the stated objectives. F. It is the basis for curriculum evaluation. The essence of education policy is to help nations to attain national development through education. For instance, in national policy on education, there are 5 national goals which are to be 1. A free and democratic society. 2. A just and egalitarian society. 3. A united, strong and self-reliant nation. 4. A great and dynamic economy. 5. A land of bright and full opportunities for all citizens. Education is expected to realize these goals. Thus, major and specific objectives were raised in line with national goals. The yardstick to measure the effectiveness of education is to examine these goals and objectives, both major and specific education objectives, if they are being achieved. This is possible through education. Need for educational reform. Reforms are inevitable and take place in educational system for different reasons. Some of these reasons are discussed as follows. A. Correction of irregularities. Sometimes, educational system of a country is being redirected to correct some practices and irregularities which could result into displacement of educational objectives. B. To accommodate changes or innovation. It is possible to have some innovation and changes that are beneficial to the nation at large. The changes or innovation might be in education or other areas or sector. Education has to be veritable tool to adapt to such changes or accommodate them. Therefore, reform is initiated in education so as to accommodate change or innovation for national development. C. Implementation of international policies on education. There are international agencies on education such as United Nations Organization (UNO), United Nations Education and Scientific Organization (UNESCO), World Bank, and so on. Some recommendations and policies relating to education come from these organizations. Countries that belong to these organizations are mandated at times to implement these policies or recommendations in their educational system. The introduction or implementation of such recommendations and policies leads to reforms in the educational system. Importance of educational policy and reforms diagnosis. From what you have learned so far, it is glaring that both educational policies and reforms are meant to ensure that education plays its fundamental roles in the development of a nation. It therefore means that the quality of education in any country depends on the kind of policies and nature of reforms introduced in educational system. This calls for concerted effort by stakeholders in analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of policies and reforms in education from time to time so as to avoid wastage in the system as well as mismatch in the societal needs and education offered. The need for diagnosis of reforms and policies in education are discussed as follows. To assess relevance of educational policy and reform to national development, ideally, policies and reforms in education are supposed to be means through which education realizes societal dreams of development. This is because education has been adjudged as bedrock of national development. Therefore, serious examination of policies and reforms in education is very necessary for adequate remedy in case the system is straying off the expected goals. All the previous policies and reforms could be diagnosed so as to learn from past mistakes. In addition, diagnosis of current policy and reform on education helps to find out the relevance of such policy for possible action. To assess the stakeholders' roles of participation in policy implementation, education stakeholders have different roles to play in policy implementation. A good policy may fail at implementation stage if individuals do not play their responsibilities. For instance, government is saddled with responsibility of policy making and funding. Ministries of education ensure implementation, while teachers, heads of schools, guidance counselor, parents, students, and private individuals have their shared responsibilities. Through effective diagnosis of education policy, role played by different stakeholders will be brought into limelight. To facilitate emerging policies and reforms for educational and national development, there is need to move with the trends of development. Effective assessment of current or previous policies and reforms helps to know the weaknesses and strengths. This gives opportunity to improve on the weaknesses in the subsequent policy and reform. Basis for comparative analysis. The evidence generated through diagnosis of different policies helps in comparison. One will be able to discover the strengths and weaknesses of these policies and come up with genuine conclusion. Summary for study section 2. At the end of this study session, you have learned that 1. Education codes are a collection of practical guidance with respect to the requirements of some statutory laws. 2. Education Act is a form of educational policy that carries the status of law or a decree promulgated by parliamentary procedure, while decree is a law or a judgment enacted on public issues by the military government. 3. Educational reform denotes a change or improvement in the educational system. 4. The need for educational policy includes giving direction to activities of stakeholders in the educational system, a framework that facilitates achievement of educational objectives, facilitating educational administration at all levels, a basis for curriculum development, facilitating curriculum development, and a basis for curriculum evaluation. While need for educational reform include correction of irregularities and implementation of international policies on education. This is the end of study section 2. Thanks for listening.